Activation and discretion warning. This episode contains explicit and graphic descriptions of physical assault, animal abuse, sexual assault, and rape. Caution and discretionary action are required. This episode is not for children. Please use extreme self-care in listening to this episode, and if you are activated or triggered and need help, call the National Sexual Assault Hotline at 1-800-656-HOPE. That's 1-800-656-4673.
I'm pretty open. I have no shame about who I am or how I got here. I think that's the most important thing that I can share, that you can be whole and still have had all of these things happen to you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. I'm glad you're here. You've just tuned into one of the most important podcasts that you may ever listen to, because the purpose of this podcast is to provide a safe space for victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault to share their stories and connect with others who've been through similar experiences. However, there are other important aspects to this podcast: community, education, and support. I believe that sharing our stories is one of the most important steps to healing, and my hope is that the SAS podcast will help victims and survivors feel less alone and more empowered. And my ultimate goal is to provide all of my listeners with insights, resources, and a supportive space where empathy, compassion, and understanding thrive. My commitment is to being there for all my listeners. I'm your host, Dave Markel, coming to you from the Podvlog studio in St. George, Utah, and I'm here each week talking to victims and survivors or interviewing experts and professionals in order to not only gain insights and information to help us on our healing path, but also to provide an education on being trauma-informed, working to help bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. Whether you're aware of it or not, we all know someone whose life has been impacted by rape or sexual assault. So I encourage everyone to listen to this podcast. Whatever your experience is with rape or sexual assault, you are not alone, and we are all here for each other. Thank you again for being here. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories. This is episode 73. Hosting this show has been nothing short of an extreme pleasure and honor for me. I've been able to meet and talk with some of the most amazing people who have endured some of the most tragic and terrible experiences, but these same people have found it within themselves to endure, accept, and grow through those painful experiences, and then give back to the rest of us their powerful recovery journey. This week's guest is a phenomenal example of just that. Merle Yost is with us today. Merle is an extremely accomplished psychotherapist and a licensed family and marriage counselor with over 25 years of experience. He is also an expert on gynecomastia and is the best-selling author of several books. He has also authored and launched a new video workshop entitled 7 Steps to Powerful Boundaries as part of his Unspoken Boundaries campaign. Merle's life story is spellbinding, and you won't want to miss this episode. So, without further ado, here's Merle. Merle Yost, welcome to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories. It's an honor to have you here. Thanks for joining me.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here, and I look forward to our conversation and being able to share that with the world.
Me too. I've been looking forward to this interview. For my audience, Merle Yost is an author of 6 books. He's a psychotherapist and he's a teacher. His latest book is Facing the Truth of Your Life. And he's here partly because he's promoting his new workshop series, although I wanted him here for a lot of other reasons too. Merle, tell us about yourself and what you do.
Yes, I've been a licensed psychotherapist for about 30 years. Long journey getting there, of course, as it should be. And I'm known for working with trauma. If you had a really messed up childhood, I'm the guy you see, or you've had just enormous amount of trauma in your life. I work with so many rape survivors and rape victims, and I actually don't like the word survivor. So we can talk about that in a minute if you like.
Yeah, let's do. I'd love to hear more about that.
I'm especially known for working with men who were sexually abused as children, bi and gay men who are heterosexually married, who are more likely to have been sexually abused as children. Very common. Men with gynecomastia, I'm internationally known for that. And so Basically, anyone who's had real trauma comes to see me, and I understand. I lived it and recovered from it. And so I have a way of holding it, I think, and seeing it and being compassionate, but not buying into being a victim.
And I like that. But explain to the audience what gynecomastia is.
Gynecomastia is men with female-like breast. About 30% of all men will be impacted by it in their lifetime. It's a liver issue. At the onset of puberty, when you get this surge of testosterone in your body, the boy, if your liver isn't up to processing that excess testosterone, it converts it to estrogen. And you can develop secondary female characteristics, of which breast is the most obvious. It's also common in guys who are alcoholics because you impair your liver, you impair your body's ability to processing the testosterone. And so I remember going to doctor the first time, I don't know, I was probably 22 years old. I was an adult. I was out in the world. I found my own doctor for the first time. And I remember going in, I took my shirt off, and he left the room, composed himself, and came back and asked me if I drank a little. And I said, no. So that was my first introduction to the doctors talking to me about it. I'm reasonably well known internationally for gynecomastia. Channel 4 and the BBC from London both flew over and did documentaries with me on it.
So when you say you treat men with this condition, I guess
there are things in the world that are going to disturb a boy more than developing secondary female characteristics. And it happens right at adolescence. So it really messes with your sense of identity. You're just starting to discover your body and figure out how this works and what it's about. And all of a sudden these breasts start appearing and like, oh my God. I remember I was in junior high school and the girls were offering their bras and the boys were pinching my breast, and somehow always ended up on the skins team on basketball. It's not like you get to hide this to yourself. Everything from puffy nipples all the way up to F and G breast. I've seen the whole range. The more obese you get, the worse they get. You're adding fat to the breast tissue. And so people don't lose weight. Well, it's not that simple, because you can lose the fat tissue, but you can't lose the breast tissue. The only way to get rid of the breast tissue after it's there is to cut it out.
And I can see, obviously, where that would cause some pretty severe emotional and psychological problems, especially as youth. Where did these come from? And why am I developing this way? Sure. When you treat it, are you dealing mostly with shame, I would guess?
That's the primary emotion coming up. Embarrassment, shame, humiliation, questioning their gender. I mean, it can cover a whole range there. My job is to guide them to acceptance. It's not a curse. This wasn't put upon them to make them feel bad. This is a biological function of something that's happening in their body. And once you get to acceptance, then you say, am I okay with this? Or am I going to do something about it? And so some guys never have them removed because their nipples are so sensitive that it becomes a predominant part of their sex life. And cutting those off means detaching that sensitivity. So they come to terms with it. This is part of my sexuality. This is part of who I am. I will attract some people. I won't attract others. And that's okay. That's called acceptance. The problem is it doesn't match our fantasy about how we're going to be in the world. And so we have to come to terms with the new picture of what that is.
It's so interesting to me because I've heard of it before. I've known about it, but I've never talked to anybody about this condition. So I always thought that it was inherited condition. Could it be random?
Yeah, I think there's a genetic predisposition. I mean, if you suddenly your liver starts failing, you can develop it. But again, you have to have a genetic predisposition to growing breasts. There's plenty of women who don't have breasts or have very little breasts. So it all depends upon your genetic predisposition. I remember being misgendered in grocery stores all the time. And it's not like I have a high voice or anything, but it's still just very strange. I mean, people see this breast and immediately assume that you're just a very masculine woman, I guess. I don't know. I didn't let it bother me because I wanted it gone, but it didn't define who I was. I tell this story when I think it was Channel 4, we were in the middle of filming this documentary and they stopped all the filming and the director turned to me and said, all these guys are falling apart that we're interviewing, talking about this, but you seem just fine. Why are you okay and they're not? And I said, well, when you look at my childhood, this doesn't even reach the top 5 of the traumas in my childhood. So This is just something else I had to deal with. They just sort of looked at me and moved on. They didn't want to talk about that.
Not surprising. And just so my audience knows, Merle and I had a getting to know each other phone conversation about a week ago. And so I know a little bit about Merle's childhood sexual assault. and some of that history, how that led to him getting into this field of psychotherapy. Merle, if you're ready and you're willing, could you tell us what you're able to about your sexual assault experience?
Absolutely. I grew up in the backwoods of the Ozarks of Missouri. The place that I have the most memory of was the last place we lived there. It was a farm out in the middle of nowhere, big garden and pigs and rabbits and a zillion dogs and no neighbors. It was my twin sister and I, and my brother was old enough at that time. He wasn't really around that much. We were just sort of isolated there out in the world. In third grade, I remember there being footsteps on the stairwell coming to my bedroom. It was a two-story log cabin, and the second floor was an unfinished attic, essentially. And there were three bedrooms. The walls weren't finished. There were no doors. There was my bedroom. At the top of the stairs was my twin sister in the middle, and my older brother at the far end. Not that my family had many boundaries to begin with, and this was just sort of an example of that. And I remember there being footsteps on the stairs. I remember leaving my body and going out the window. And I don't have any other memory at all. And this happened repeatedly. I remember the next day, I couldn't get on the school bus. Every time I thought about getting on that school bus, I got nauseous. And I was overwhelmed with all of these feelings. I was about, third grade, something like 9. I overwhelmed with all of this energy that I didn't understand at all. And I remember just wandering around lost, literally trying to throw it up. I had what is called occluded memory, or we call it repressed memories, because it was so overwhelming. There was nothing that I could do. And as it turns out, one of the things that causes dissociation most is shutting off the airways. Stop breathing. That will cause you to dissociate. And so what happened is that my father face fucked me brutally. And so I was suffocating. And so I just passed out. So I, to this day, have a problem with anything affecting my breathing, understandably. That was the beginning. And this went on for 3 years until we left there and we moved to the ghetto in Tucson, Arizona, and everything changed. It was like he became a completely different person and all of that disappeared. It was night and day.
I have a question. You said that your memories of this started in about third grade, about 9 years old.
I knew something happened. I didn't know what it was. Yes.
And how long did it take for you to come to the point where your memories started coming back to you and you actually did know what it was?
Somewhere around 20, I had got out of high school and went to college. I was a music major. I wasn't doing well because I was so dissociated and had no idea that I was dissociated. It was just the whole world was kind of a blur to me through that part of my life. One of my roommates had suggested that I might benefit from some therapy. And so I said, sure, because I don't understand what's going on. So I went to see this therapist. I'm sitting in the first session, we're talking, and she says, you seem nervous. Are you afraid of me? And I looked at her and said, no. She said, what are you afraid of? I said, what's inside of me? And that was the beginning of therapy. And then 1993, I was in the postgraduate school. I was working as an intern as a therapist, and my supervisor and I decided to go to this new method of psychotherapy called EMDR. And so we went. This was 1993, and Francine didn't start teaching until 1988 or something like that. So this was fairly early on in the whole thing. And so I learned it from Francine Shapiro, who was the originator.
Most people have heard the term EMDR, but could you tell the audience who doesn't know what that means?
EMDR is for eye movement, desensitization, reprocessing. What she was walking along one day and was thinking about some trauma that was happening, and all of a sudden she noticed her eyes were moving in a particular way. And that got her attention as she was processing. So she started experimenting with that and eventually developed what has become known as EMDR.
And it's been a pretty controversial treatment up until recently. It seems to be gaining a lot more popularity and credibility through the years, too. I've heard really good things about it.
It challenged the paradigm of healing for a lot of therapists in a lot of the world. They couldn't imagine that you could process something so quickly. You could change a person's life in a single session. And I've done it many, many, many times. Virtually never do I see a woman who hasn't been raped at least once, if not multiple times. And so I can clear a rape in a single session. It's just gone. And it frees them. And I've done similar things with men who've been gangbanged and raped and other traumas in their life. It's amazing. It's like a miracle taking place. And so we were in the training. It was the very first day. We had done training most of the day, and then they had us practice the technique. And they told us they wanted us to pick something small. a small T trauma, not a big T trauma, because they didn't want to open up this huge can of worms in the middle of the training because you weren't fully trained. And I remember, again, I had no memory of this. I knew something had happened back then, but I didn't know what it was. But what I did have was a fear of tall buildings. I'd look up at a tall building and just about pass out. We now know that phobias are really a cover for trauma most of the time. So if you're terrified of those bees or terrified of this or that, there's probably a trauma underneath there that you're hiding, that you don't know that you're hiding, that's so scary to you that you have to have this other thing to distract you from. And so about 30 seconds into doing the EMDR, my head went back, cock went down my throat, and I totally dissociated. And that was the beginning of the memories coming back and the years of work on healing the abuse. The problem was that was the only memory that came back. I had all the symptomology. All my therapists all along said, you have all the symptomology of somebody who's been sexually abused. And I literally did. I was sexually compulsive. I dissociated. There was all this stuff. And so it was all there, but this opened the door that started the healing.
In my mind, I'm correlating what you said before, your phobia of tall buildings, with that whole concept of your head going up and back.
Well, no, it was about being in my bed and looking up at my dad.
Okay. So interesting.
Yeah, he was a scary guy. He was really angry. We got punished pretty severely at times. And he'd get mad at an animal, he'd kill it. I saw many dogs beaten to death or shot. We all were terrified of him. All of us, I mean, even my mother. And so, but the irony is that when we moved from that farm in the backwoods of the Ozarks to Arizona, he magically turned into a different person. It was so weird. It was so confusing. And I hated him. And I didn't know why I hated him so much. I just hated him. It was much later for all the pieces fell into place.
Are you able to talk to us about that different person? Tell me more about that. Better, worse?
It was very weird. It was like whiplash and like, what the hell just happened? We were in junior high at that point. And so we were in a city. So we weren't out in the middle of nowhere. Eyes were on us all the time. Initial job there was that they took managing this small hotel. And so we were constantly under the vision of all these people all the time coming and going. And it was a lot of snowbirds. A snowbird is older people who move in the winter to the warmer climates wisely. And so it was full of snowbirds. And I would seem to adopt all the older ones as my grandparents of sorts, because I never had that much contact with my grandparents. But he just turned into kind of this sweet guy. And at that point, I was also a lot more independent. I was establishing myself outside the house as much as possible. I was really good in school. And by the time I got to high school, because that was junior high, I was really kind of in my own orbit at that point. So we didn't have a lot of interaction.
Did your relationship get better with him after he changed?
When I moved out of the house, I wouldn't speak to him for years. And I didn't know why. I just felt this rage inside of me whenever he was around. And it wasn't just killing the family pets. There was clearly something more going on there. And so when the sexual abuse came up, the pieces started falling into place.
Tell us more about your recovery then, once that fell into place and after that.
Well, fortunately, I was in therapy, and I spent roughly 17 years in psychotherapy. So I really needed it, the childhood I came up with, because there's a lot more than that. That's just dad. We talked about mom. There's a whole nother nightmare and can of worms.
I think the audience would be interested in hearing about that aspect of your life also.
There was no safe place in my home, literally. And so that was why as soon as I could get out in the world and do things, I was gone. I spent as much time away doing things as I could because that was safe. Yeah. So overactive and all these different things just simply because I had to get out of the house. I mean, being around these people was not safe, even though in Tucson, everything really calmed down and there wasn't the violence. There wasn't all the stuff going on so overtly. My mother was still crazy, but it was never going to be safe for me. I eventually stopped all contact with him for a lot of years. In the therapy, I sort of made peace with it to some degree, though I was never going to trust them. I was never going to be close. They were never going to earn that because they never, ever acknowledged what happened. They never, ever apologized for what they did. They never owned it in any way. And so there was no possibility there of healing with them. My job was to come to acceptance rather than being a victim. Acceptance for what had happened to me, owning that I couldn't change that I had to then either accept that this is just how things were going to be, or I was going to do something to make it different. And I did something to make it different. I did a hell of a lot of therapy and healing, Part of that was my time in the Gestalt Institute. I spent 2 years in the Gestalt Institute training program. It was very intense psychotherapy and did some really profound healing work in there. I'm a trained Gestalt therapist, obviously, and a somatic therapist. And so I know what can be done and how to do that. And modern therapy doesn't get any of the training that I got. So it just feels like a different universe from what I grew up in as a therapist.
Is there a way to put that in a nutshell? Because I've heard of it, but I don't know anything and how that all works.
Gestalt is one of the original humanistic paradigms for psychotherapy. It's about two human beings here meeting at that contact boundary and seeing what emerges between the two of us and processing and dealing with that. And it's about being somatically aware of what's going on in your bodies. Everything is stored in our bodies. So you have to go back into that feeling and dive into it and hang out there and see what your body's trying to tell you it needs to feel and to heal now. So much of therapy today is about, I call it about rearranging the furniture in your head as opposed to redoing the foundation and remodeling the house. So, and I'm all about, let's go in and get into the foundation and clean this up so that you can build the house that you want to have, as opposed to just move the furniture around and hope you aren't going to stumble. And current therapy is much more about moving the furniture around in hopes that that solves the problem.
And so you're talking about things like cognitive behavioral therapy as being the source of just moving the furniture around and
Yes.
this process going down to the foundation. And you said that you spent 2 years at that.
At the training program, plus all of my therapy was with Gestalt therapists, as it turned out. My very first therapist turned out to be a Gestalt therapist, and a good one. It was the beginning, and so it never occurred to me to study anything besides Gestalt because I understood the power of it. I was really naive about the rest of psychotherapy. I mean, all of my therapists combined psychodynamic work with Gestalt work, so that you were looking at the deep unconscious stuff and all of the developmental stuff and all that, it's a really great combination of the two because it gives you a Gestalt, a complete picture of the whole person and what you have to do. And so that's all my training. And I'm really grateful for all of the teachers that I had and all of the therapists that I had who really helped this very strange little guy. I was very odd. I mean, how could I not be?
Let's talk then a little bit about your mom and
Okay.
her contribution to you being a strange little guy.
Mom, and I was close to my mother. My older brother was her favorite, and my twin sister, is my father's favorite, and I was the lost child, which turned out to be the ideal place for me. It was the safest of all the positions, as it turned out. I'll do my mom in a nutshell here because there's a lot to unpack here. We really wanted to go into the deep end of the pool. I spent most of my time in training therapy trying to figure out just how to diagnose my mother. And that's part of your job as a therapist, diagnose your parent. Oh yeah, it's like this is our world that we grew up in, so we have to make sense out of it. And nobody's been able to, because I can describe my experience of it, but they need to experience her directly in order to be able to diagnose really accurately. And even with all I know, it's somewhere between the dissociative identity disorder and schizophrenia. I was raised essentially in a cult. It was just the family. It was just the five of us. My mother's delusion that she was ruler of the world, sitting on the right hand of God, and Jesus was on the left hand of God. We got daily missives from gods and the angels, and it's quite elaborate. And this was daily conversation for years and years and years, all of my childhood. So I just grew up with this. It never occurred to me. We were told if we told anybody who we really were, we'd be killed. She was supposed to be the cousin of Queen Elizabeth. She was secretly managing all the affairs of the world. And it's like, but as a kid, you believe your parents. You don't really have a choice. So in between the violence and scariness of my dad, and in between the unhinged of my mother, there wasn't a whole lot of safety in my childhood.
Sure.
And are you familiar with lucid dreaming?
The term, but not the definition.
Lucid dreaming is being consciously aware that you're dreaming. So it means you're awake in your dream. So you can move things around, you can change the outcome, you can just watch, you can play along, but you're consciously awake inside. So I lucid dream virtually every night. And my experience of people who lucid dream is that it's their one place that they can be in charge and can control of. And so I find this mostly my experience of people who lucid dream regularly or easily are people who had really traumatic childhoods. There are people who spend their whole lives trying to have one lucid dream. I'm like, that's last night. So it just was normal for me. It never occurred to me that other people weren't awake in their dreams, that they weren't conscious and couldn't. If that monster was there, you like, do you want to kill the monster? What do you want to do with the monster? Yeah, there was nothing normal about my childhood on virtually any level. I was like this alien. And looking back, I can understand why all my peers saw me as an alien. And I had no idea because this was just normal. Adolescence was not particularly fun, but I don't think it is for most people.
I guess adolescence is a small T for most people. Did the sexual abuse from your father stop when you moved to Tucson?
Yes, everything changed.
But your mom continued the delusion?
Oh, yeah. I stopped talking to all my family many years ago. I wrote them a letter and said, it's been interesting. I'm grateful for the good stuff, but I'm done. I'm not going to take your phone calls. I'm not going to read your letters. I'm finished. I wish you a good life and be well. And then I did write one last letter to my mother in her 80-something birthday. She died a year ago in May. I wrote her a letter and said that I cannot imagine the kind of trauma that you grew up in that required you to fracture in the way that you did, to live in so many different worlds because yours was so unsafe. And I'm sorry that happened. And so I then said some other things about her dying and so forth. And that was just the whole letter. That was my last gift to my mother.
Have you processed all of that also? Even talking about it now with me, it brings up a lot of implicit memory and explicit memory that it just seems like everyone I talk to says, man, every time I talk about this, I remember more stuff. And so I'm just wondering if you can address that for us, how you process all of this.
Well, 17 years of therapy helped a lot, and with really kind therapists and good ones. So I don't believe in being a victim. I actually wrote a whole chapter in my last book, 2 chapters actually on the topic. One is on forgiveness and the other is on what I call the victim identity disorder. I wrote my version of a DSM diagnosis. But to live as a victim is a dead end. That means there's no healing. That means there's no tomorrow, that you're stuck in the past and you're just going around and around the drain and nothing ever changes. We've all been victimized. Every one of us has been victimized from a little bit to a lot in our lives. And so I think the task is to come to terms with that. And I think it is to accept that it happened. And like, okay, I can't change that. That happened. I can heal it. I can do what I can to heal it and process it. But also, and this is where the forgiveness comes in, because I don't believe in forgiveness. I think it's a really bad concept, because forgiveness means absolution. You're offering absolution to someone for doing something horrific to you. And I also differentiate between big hurts and small hurts. And this is talking about big hurts. They killed your child. They cut off your arm. They did something that irreparably changed your life, like fucking you as a child. That irreparably changed your life. And so if I give them absolution, one, I'm trying to rush to get away from all those bad feelings. And the task of the individual is to go in and process and heal those by taking back all of your power, processing all the hurt, all the anger, discharging all of that, and moving through that healing process so that you're complete the way you are. Their job is to offer an apology and make an amends. And if you forgive them, if you offer them absolution, then you're depriving them of the opportunity of cleaning up their part of that. And that's their karma. You can't take away their karma.
With the vernacular that is floating around in our society and in our culture, and you saying, I don't like the term victim, is there a different label, a better label, or is there no label? I mean, you say, and I agree with you, we're all victims of something, big or small.
We've all been victimized. Being victimized is very different than being a victim. Victimized is something in process. And so what am I going to do with having been victimized by my father? Am I just going to lay down and say, okay, just keep hurting me the rest of my life because I can't heal this, or I can't deal with this, or I can't whatever? Well, the only person that's being hurt by that is you. He's not being hurt by that. So you wallowing around in self-pity and loathing and all of this is not helping you, and it's not hurting him. So there's no benefit. There's no payoff unless you get off on being a victim. Unless you have to be in pain to justify not doing something else in your life that you should be doing because you're too busy wallowing in this past. We have to go back and confront it, deal with it, feel the pain, discharge the anger, do whatever you need to do that. Write the letter, do whatever it is you need to discharge that. Tell a group of people what happened to you so that they're the profound witness of your pain and consequently a part of your healing. That's the whole point of 12-step groups, is to have a place to take your shame and having witnessed so that you can process it and move past it.
Absolutely. I encourage people of that constantly. I do use the word victim because I haven't come up with a better label, but I encourage people to move from victimhood to survivorship constantly.
It's just about having the compassion for that little boy that had to go through all that.
That's what this platform is about, is let's talk about that. Let's tell people what we've been through and how we can grow from that. Some people aren't ready to talk about that. I get that. I don't want to force anyone or make them feel like the whole purpose of sexual assault survivor stories is to make people get to the point where they can tell their story. Because I don't know that that's necessary for healing always. I think it's a great component, and
you have to tell someone, whether it be your therapist or whoever's holding you as you walk through that dark night.
But it doesn't have to be the world on a podcast.
No, I think I have a unique perspective. I think that is something to share with the world. And it's also going to be the subject of my next book. It's my memoir, will be my 7th book, which will be about my journey. I've had a rather extraordinary life in so many ways, and I'm grateful for all of it, even the bad, because it's made me who I am.
Merle, that's why I wanted you here, was to say exactly that, because I think my audience needs to hear all kinds of different perspectives, especially this one after I found out about you and read about you, that your workshops and your books, I think, are things that I need to get more into myself. I'm thrilled that my audience gets to hear you, and I hope you get lots of contact from my audience, because I'm in awe about your education, your empathy, your understanding. Everything about what you're talking about, I think, is so critical for an audience to hear, because to me, this is like a privilege. It's really great.
And I appreciate somebody who understands what I'm saying. I'm pretty open. I have no shame about who I am or how I got here. I think that's the most important thing that I can share, that you can be whole and still have had all of these things happen to you, is ultimately the message that I want people to know. But it's going to require work on your part. You have to be willing to face the pain. You have to be willing to be angry at who did this to you. And you also have to be willing to process all that anger so that you can be whole and not give away your power every time you think about this person or that situation. It's a losing scenario and does not make for a great life.
I deal with a lot of guests who talk about that very thing, that so much of what they experience in life activates a lot of those memories and pains and hurts, and they can't get past it. And they're even in therapy. Will you talk to us some more about some of the therapeutic techniques, measures, applications that you give to people?
Well, I think the core of all of it is moving through being a victim. Whatever approach or technique you use, and I'm a huge proponent of EMDR, I'm a huge proponent of Gestalt and psychodynamic therapy, because all three of those are all about unearthing the roots of this and cleaning out those channels so that you then have flow of energy through there without triggering things. And you can do that. It's entirely possible. EMDR is like going down all those pathways and cleaning them out so that they're just done, they're unblocked, and you can have the life flow through there without triggering that experience because you've cleaned it out. And psychodynamic therapy can do that, and so Gestalt, but EMDR is just so much faster, it's so much easier. And so the problem is that we have glorified being a victim in our culture, and our whole culture now is based upon who's the biggest victim. And so instead of healing being a victim, we like monuments out to them and say, oh, you're such a big victim. And somehow you're alive. And it's like, there's no win in that. There's no glory in being a victim. There's just no healing in that. You have to go through the pain. You have to process it. And people have had worse pain than I've had. And I have all compassion for that, but they still get to take the same journey. And the journey is to go back and confront that pain, face it head on with somebody holding you and loving you at the same time as you go through that and come out the other side whole. Because as long as you live as a victim, you have this giant hole inside of you, this giant wound that doesn't ever go away. Some people are so identified with that wound, they don't want to know who they are beyond that, because they've decided this is it. This is who I am. And as long as they stay in that place, nothing's ever going to change.
Totally agree with that.
It's a journey.
I use that word a lot too. The word Gestalt, is that the name of the person who developed the technique, or does that refer to that type of therapy?
Gestalt therapy was founded by Fritz and Laura Perls. It was one of the original humanistic psychotherapies. Gestalt is a German word. It just simply means the whole, the complete truth of that, the whole being, for lack of a better word. The Gestalt is how it's all organized. Your Gestalt is how this is organized for you. So we each have our own Gestalt, and some are better than others.
It helps a lot. I know there are probably people out there who knew exactly what you were talking about, but I'm not one of them. So thank you for that explanation.
Oh, sure.
My next question is, you mentioned how effective Gestalt therapy is, that it is a faster therapy, and you utilize EMDR. Is that part of Gestalt therapy, or did you adopt that as an additional part of your therapy?
Yeah, it works out very nicely with Gestalt, because Gestalt is about going directly into the pain, facing the truth of what's going on and owning it, and stop denying the impact that it had on you. Once you get the impact it had on you and own you, then you have the healing. That's the first step. Then you have to go through the pain, having had that experience. And EMDR actually is faster. If you can get to the core of what's going on, and a good EMDR therapist should be able to get you there if you're at all willing. And if you're not willing, they always say, you can't teach a pig to sing because it frustrates you and it annoys the pig. And so if they're not ready to heal, you're just going to annoy the piss out of them, and you're going to get frustrated. And that's sometimes why it takes a long time, because often people have to go into therapy a long time before they get ready to heal. They have to build the trust. They have to take the time to expose small things before they're really willing to open up about the big things. And so that's why it isn't always instant. And so people who come in for EMDR are aware of what the trauma is and are ready to face it, or they're not going to be there, because you have to be willing to face it.
What about those in my audience and people I've spoken to, and I'm one of them, who say CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, really worked for me? It really helped me. It provided a lot of healing for me.
Good. I'm glad. I think it has its place. But as a whole, the thing that pisses me off is that they keep this is evidence-based that this works. Well, it does work in the short term. And the reason that it works is it's why insurance companies like it, because it's a quick fix typically. And so the problem is the studies show that for most people, 12 to 14 months later, the symptoms come back. And so for some people, the healing can be in simply being seen, having the pain profoundly witnessed, and being believed. For some people, that's enough. And that's great. But that's not true for everybody. Depends on how complex the trauma it is, depends upon how intertwined in other things it is. And so for the people that it works that way for, great. I'm so happy. It's just I tend to work with more complex trauma. And so CBT, again, has its place. It's not the be-all, end-all that they're trying to sell it as being.
That brings me to the workshop. Do you want to address the workshop and how those steps work?
Sure. Boundaries is something we talk a lot about in society. It's a really common conversation. The thing that we don't want to talk about is that all of our boundaries come out of our family. How our family treated us is how we think boundaries work. And how our relationship with our dad is how we think we're supposed to interact with men. How we interact with our mom is how we are supposed to interact with women. And we take that out into the world. And sometimes it works, and a lot of the time it doesn't. But this is the only model you know. And so I call it the dance of intimacy. In order to truly understand your boundaries and heal them and come to a different conclusion about how they work, you first have to go back and explore that dance of intimacy that you learned from your family. Step one in my workshop is about going back and revisiting your childhood, looking at what you learned about you and or your place in the world and your place in the family and how boundaries work and who loved you and who didn't love you. And if you grew up in a family where somebody's method of love was beating you, or their method of love was diminishing you or demeaning you in some way, Well, you think that's how it's supposed to be. You naturally go out into the world and you're looking for that because that's your dance of intimacy. And that's how we end up marrying our parents, because that was the dance. And we meet this one, oh, it just feels like we've known each other forever. You found the same dance. And then you recreate your family and wonder why it's no more better than the family you grew up in. And we don't talk enough about this because family is sacred. And family has connotations around it. They're supposed to be wonderful. Well, frankly, most families aren't very much fun and are really pretty traumatic because they don't heal the trauma, and then they pass the trauma on to their children, and then it just goes on generation after generation after generation. It's true for sexual abuse. If you have boundaries crossed in your family, then it becomes cross-generational because it's been normalized that that's just what you do in family. You have to go back, look at that and own it and find a way to heal that so that you can move on. And there's so much more to boundaries than that. And so steps 1 and step 4 are the really intense ones. And step 4 is looking at guilt and shame. It's a really deep dive into guilt and shame. Once you recognize what's going on and you know what to do to heal that, it changes the whole way you are in the world because you aren't giving in to these people who are guilting you. You aren't taking on how they shame you as if it's your problem. It's their problem. And so it completely changes how you hold both of those because I explain what they really are and what their benefits and downsides are and mostly how to heal it. And step 2 is just a very academic description of 15 different major boundaries, so that you have some idea of what we're talking about here. A simple version of that is different cultures say hello and greet you in different ways. So if you grow up in one culture doing it one way and go to another, and they're going to think you're really weird and you're strange, and you're going to think they're weird and strange. And that's a boundary. So when you go into a new culture, you have to learn what their norms are and what's acceptable and the boundary.
There's how many steps in that program?
There's 7 steps. Step 3 and 5 are what I think are the most important because what they teach you about energetic boundaries. It is the core of what boundaries actually are. Boundary is knowing where I stop and you start. But we're all made up of atoms. We're all energy. And so when we come up against another person, our energy is mingling with their energy. And I teach you how these energetic boundaries work so that you can make contact with their bubble without merging. And you can know what's going on in their bubble without sucking it up like a vacuum cleaner and interact accordingly. And so that changes the whole dynamic because if you're out in the world and sucking up everything that's going on around you, then you're just overwhelmed and exhausted with everybody else's feelings. Then you have to figure out how to discharge it. And most people don't know how to do that either. I'm teaching a whole basic skill set here about a different way of being in the world that is so powerful. 6 is giving you more tools to heal relationships. What I use this word, staying in your bubble, staying in your field, your energy field, and not merging with other people's energy field. So that's what I mean by the bubble. There's something that is gaining a lot of ground in psychotherapy called interoception. Basically, they're saying the brain is not really the center of who we are. The brain is simply a processing unit. And that through all the nerve endings in our body and through all of these senses, we're scanning the environment around us and gathering data. And then we pull it back inside and we shoot it up to the brain and it processes what needs to be dealt with or not dealt with in that moment. I've created a scale of interoception, intuition, and clairvoyance. And they're all based upon the same thing. And so that's a lot of what step 6 is about, is explaining what these different are and how you get into them and what happens. And it's fascinating. And then step 7 is when I pull it all together. I integrate all the pieces, the meditation, your spirituality. It can be Christian, it can be Jewish, it can be Islam. You integrate your spirituality into this. By combining all these pieces, it changes your whole experience of being in the world. Because again, instead of merging with everybody around and feeling their feelings and sucking up all of their trauma, you actually stay present in you and stay a witness to their state of being. Because there's no benefit in intruding upon them. The benefit, the healing, is being a witness to another person's pain and experience. And that's helping them. Merging with, oh, I feel your pain. It's so horrible. And how many times have you gone to somebody upset about something and end up taking care of them because they fall apart? Yeah. Because they just absorbed all of it and they've violated your space. I teach you how not to do that and how to hold that in a way that's healing to you and to them and makes being in the world a whole lot easier because we've made it complicated. It's not that complicated.
Which made me think of the word empathy. A lot of people think being empathic means exactly what you just said, of the wrong way of being
Yes.
involved in that person's bubble. And I think being empathic is more along the terms of what I'm hearing you say, understanding it, but not taking it on and knowing where your boundary stops with
Yes.
that empathy.
I think that empathy and compassion is about being a profound witness of the other person's experience and validate. They need to be seen. They need to be validated that their pain is real, that they're not making this up. This was truly life-changing or horrible, so that they can begin their healing process. They don't have to doubt their feelings. They don't have to doubt their experience. They can then move through it. That's the words I used in the workshop. I talked about being a profound witness to another person's experience. Absorbing it is rude, it's intrusive, and it doesn't help either.
So true. I often tell people I'm not a therapist, but much of what I say and what I emit can be therapeutic. I don't try and dispense therapy. I just try and dispense an acceptance.
Yes, that is therapy. That is the deepest core. Like 12-step groups, when they talk about their shame and not being humiliated for their shame, that should happen in psychotherapy as well. And I say, if a therapist shames you because of something you said, you need a new therapist.
Spot on. Absolutely
Very simple.
correct.
And your job is to hold them and to help them deconstruct whatever happened and work through it and heal it, but not to shame them or to make them feel bad. They feel bad enough already. They need to be able to feel bad and still be loved, just like a parent of a child.
There's so much insight to what you're saying and so much power. I just mentioned that we could go on all night, and I would love to have you talk about love and intimacy, but I'm wondering if we can save that for another episode.
Sure. Happy to.
This has been amazing because you are just so impactful and insightful. I'm very much looking forward to doing this again.
I look forward to it. I don't know. I got clear that this lifetime was about being a teacher, and all these years of psychotherapy have brought me to the place of truly giving me what I need to be the teacher I was to become. And so now this is the stage I'm at.
It's awesome. I'm glad that you and I have connected. Thank you for spending this time with me.
Oh, my pleasure.
Okay.
I look forward to our next meeting.
That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. My deepest and heartfelt thanks go out to Merle Yost. Merle, I can't thank you enough for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be with me and for sharing your amazing story. Your assault, rape, recovery, and then the resultant desire to become a psychotherapist and to share your insights and compassion with others who've suffered trauma is truly inspiring. Again, thank you. For those of you in my audience who've been impacted in a way that makes you want to learn more and reach out to Merle, please take a look at the episode notes. You'll find ways to get Merle's books, his online video workshop, and learn more about Merle's fantastic story. Thank you for tuning in to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories. As always, I would greatly appreciate you subscribing to this podcast and leaving me a rating and your comments on how this show has impacted your life. And a heartfelt thank you to those who already have. It means the world to me. And please let your friends, family, coworkers, and acquaintances know that we're here for everyone. Also, please don't forget to do your part to help bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. You can do this in many ways, but one of the best ways is to start by believing, because we all know someone whose life has been affected by rape or sexual assault. We'll see you next week.